Hi my loves, welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing my September and October books for you. I read so many good books this month. Even the ones that I was less keen on, I feel like added something to my reading and were interesting in some way. This is my big old pile. There's a lot of works going on today, so I'm sorry if you can hear that in the background. I will be investing in a microphone one of these days, I promise. So I've just remembered that I didn't tell you the next book club books. But if you'd like to join book club reading along with us, you don't have to join the Patreon. You can just read along with me over the next couple of months and then chat in the comments of the next book video, or just compare your thoughts to my thoughts when I'm speaking about the book. But of course, if you would like to join us on the Patreon, please do. It is so wonderful. I have enjoyed having that book club so much, and it has really enhanced the way I think about books and my understanding of my books. Just having people to bounce ideas off and think about books with, it's been really wonderful. And not only do we have the book club books, we run like smaller buddy reads as well for if a few of us want to read a specific book around a certain time, and there's those going on at all times as well. But our two book club picks for November and December, we've got The Sellout by Paul Beattie for November, so I'll be rereading this one this month. And we've got 1,000 Acres by Jane Smythe for December, so I'll be rereading this one in December, and if you fancy joining us, please do. So we had two book club books in the September and October period. One was Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, and one was Stoner by John Williams. Very different books. I have talked about Vita Nostra on here before because this is actually a reread, so I won't talk too much about this one. I'll link up if you go into my blog post for this video, you can go and read my original review. Suffice it to say, I enjoyed it even more on a second read. I first read this in July 2020. I actually listened to it. It makes for a good audiobook, I think, but I was very excited when we picked it for book club because I got to read it properly. That's how I most enjoy consuming books, and how I get like the most value out of my books is by actually reading them. And I really enjoyed delving into all of its complexities. It combines philosophy, linguistics, quantum physics, into some kind of crazy book. It can be a frustrating and challenging read. It's about this girl called Sasha. While she's on holiday, she meets this mysterious man who tasks her with going for a swim at, I think it's like 4 a.m. in the morning, every morning. And very strange, very uncanny feeling, and in the end she ends up at this school, this institute for special technologies they call it, where she doesn't really know what she's there for, she doesn't really know what she's studying, and it slowly becomes revealed over the course of the book. It is so good. It's such a unique take on the magic school sort of fantasy trope. It's so clever, and I really enjoyed discussing it with other members of the book club. And even better news, so this came up for discussion as well, because the original Metamorphosis trilogy, of which this is number one, is a selection of unconnected stories, like they don't have the same characters in them, and they're about metamorphoses. But I think because of the popularity of this book, the authors then went on to write more of Sasha's story. Only a couple of years ago, I think it was released in the Russian, and that is being translated and coming out spring 2023 in English. So I am super excited for that. I think it's going to have to reveal it's going to have to conclusively answer at least a couple questions that are still left over from Vita Nostra in the way that the authors decide to take the story forward. Sadly, I think Sergey Dyachenko has now actually passed away as well. But yes, I am so looking forward to that. So there's still time to read this one before that comes out if you're interested. And it's definitely a favourite of mine now. Such an interesting and unique fantasy book. So our other book club pick was Stoner by John Williams. The Greatest Novel You've Never Read. It was published originally in the 60s, and then it's had a bit of a renaissance over the past decade or so, I think. Now it's one of those books that nobody's ever heard of, but kind of everybody's heard of. and we picked it for book club, and it is a new all-time favourite as well. It was almost universally beloved in the book club, which I feel like is going to be a rare event. And yes, I think I speak for us all when I say we highly recommend it. But what's it about? So it's about William Stoner. It's not about a stoner. It's about a man named William Stoner living in Missouri in the early part of the 20th century. It kind of goes through both world wars. He is born onto a farm. He spends his childhood on the farm. We don't see a lot of that. What we mostly see is his father sends him to university to learn about farming, and there he discovers a passion for English literature and for teaching, and he ends up basically spending his entire life at the University of Missouri. The greatest love of his life is absolutely his literature and teaching. Yeah, it's a quiet novel about a, you might think, unremarkable man. His career is kind of thwarted as well by a long-standing feud. He marries the wrong woman, and his family life is kind of unsatisfactory as a result. His one great love affair is also ended as a result of his problems with a particular colleague at the university. And in general, you know, he leads a quiet, unremarkable life. And when he's dead, you know, very few people remember him, which is basically how the book opens, saying that. Williams does such a beautiful job in this book of showing us what we miss when all we see is a list of accomplishments or a list of things done in a life. Like, he shows us a life of occasional drudgery, absolutely, you know, long stretches of life might not be very exciting and might be very boring. He shows us disappointment, he shows us heartache. There is a lot of that in there. This may move you to tears. But he also shows us the worth of Stoner's life, what beauty there is in simply living, and the small moments that really make up a life, you know, the small moments that you cling to and the moments where you feel most alive, and the good things that do happen, how it's important to kind of be grateful for those things. Like, he finds a career that he really loves and feels passionately about. He does have a love affair. Williams really makes you feel for him, and for other characters, other unlikable characters. I think the role of upbringing and childhood is quite important in this book. Yeah, it was just, if you like quiet novels, contemplative novels, not a lot happens in this book, but I would say it has more action than some books that I've read. You know, we are following a life and a sequence of events. Williams does a wonderful job with the pacing. That was something that we also discussed, because it's so easy with a book like this to get the pacing wrong, I think, but we skip like chunks of years and then we'll focus in on the tiniest of moments, and it totally works. It keeps you wanting to read. There's always something that you want to discover in Stoner's life. So yeah, it really is a gem of a novel. If you, as I say, if you like quiet contemplative novels, then I really think you'll like this one. It's also a campus novel. It's nice. Something about it's nice for this time of year, even though it isn't overtly wintry. There is actually a very wintry moment in it, but it's not overtly wintry, but I would really recommend this one for your next few months reading. So next up we have The End by James Smith. I think it must be Smith instead of Smythe, but I'm not sure. So I didn't know what to expect from this book, especially when I actually engaged my brain and discovered that it was the final book in the Anomaly Quartet, which is about the anomaly, unsurprisingly. I thought my reading would be really hindered by having not read the previous books, but I think each book is kind of a self-contained story about the anomaly more generally, and sequentially they follow on from each other. But anyway, it totally worked as a standalone, and you could read it as a standalone with ease, as I did, because it's about a whole new character, I think, and the anomaly is explained enough for you to understand what's happening. I would like to get round to the previous books at some point, but my TBR is immense. In this book, the anomaly has finally enveloped the Earth. So the other books, I think, deal with its approach. I think they're mostly space-based, whereas this one is all completely set on Earth, which I think is different from the other books. Now that it's enveloped the Earth, the whole world is experiencing what the people before have experienced. So when you're in the anomaly, you can't die. It will loop you back to where you were when you were first enveloped by the anomaly, but you'll have no memory of the intervening time. So it's a really interesting concept, because in the first place you think, well, this is a deathless world, surely nobody cares about dying anymore. But actually the loss of that intervening period, especially if your companions maybe haven't died, so they'll remember you but you won't remember you, or you change, or you spend decades in the anomaly and you lose all memory of that life, but you still have to go on living. It actually makes people the majority of the people in the novel, more cautious about death, which I thought was a really interesting concept. And in general, the concept is treated really well. I think he does a good job of seeing all sides, as many sides as possible. Sometimes a tiny little bit, it feels a little bit like he's got a list of things that he's like, well, this would happen and this would happen and this would happen, and kind of fitting them into the narrative. But to be honest, I don't have too much problem with that. Yes, we see all sorts of things here, some of it quite horrifying. Some people who died just after being enveloped by the anomaly, or have lives full of suffering during that short time, are just in a constant loop of kind of living and dying, living and dying, living and dying. So more specifically, there is a kind of more specific storyline here, which is that we are following Theo. He has this life-threatening virus, which is actually man-made, and he should have died decades ago, but he somehow lived a long, long time. Everyone else who's had this virus has died. He somehow has lived a long time within the anomaly, so his life is pretty precious to him at this point. He does not want to be looped back. He hears reports of his estranged wife living in London, thousands of miles away from him in LA, where they used to live together, and he decides to embark upon one last journey to find out what happened between them, why she left, and just, I guess, to get closure. Because most infrastructure has completely collapsed in the wake of the anomaly, he has to get himself there by walking and borrowing rides and that kind of thing. Something else I liked about this book is that kind of journey narrative. It's an old classic. It's been done thousands and thousands of times, but it just really works because, your character will encounter different things, different people, different scenarios, and it just totally worked here, as it has in many other narratives. This book actually references the road. Obviously, Theo is travelling across a kind of ravaged, apocalyptic landscape, especially in the western half of the US. Yes, in my head I thought of the road, and then he actually mentioned it, and then I ended up doing a buddy read and rereading the road in October. So it's kind of nice to read these two books together, even though they are quite different, but they do have that core narrative is similar. But yeah, I found both very satisfying for that kind of journey narrative. But yeah, it's a page turner. The pacing is good. There's never a moment when you're kind of bored with it, but at the same time it's clever and thoughtful, and by the end I felt quite moved by this book. I thought the ending was good. Endings are so hard. Thought the ending of this one was really good. And I think at the end, the author mentions that he wrote this book in two stretches, the first pre-pandemic and the second post-pandemic, and I definitely, even before I had read this note, felt that coming through, and it felt like a sort of post-pandemic novel, especially the second half, not in a sort of hackneyed, obvious sort of way, Emily St. John Mandel, Sea of Tranquility, but in a sort of something of the pain and sadness and isolation, but also like community coming together sort of feeling of that time came through in the pages. Yeah, it really added to my kind of feeling for this book as well. So I really would recommend this one. It totally surprised me. I wasn't sure what to expect from it at all, but yeah, I really, really enjoyed it, and I will be keeping an eye on him. I don't know if he's read I think he's written other things apart from the Anomaly Quartet as well. I'm not sure. So let's talk about The Road, shall we? Because I read this so long ago, I have no record of reading it. And I've been keeping a close record of my reading for at least 6 or 7 years. Not sure when I started my Goodreads. Yeah, I reckon I read this about 10 years ago at least. And I remember reading it because I'd watched the film and I liked the film. I rewatched the film, by the way, after I read this, and I liked it again. It's quite a close adaptation of the book, as close as you can be with a Cormac McCarthy work, I suspect. I remember reading the book because I liked the film, and I had also heard about the book, I think. I vaguely remembered liking it. I remember thinking that the writing style was quite striking. I think I hadn't read a lot of books like this at the time, whereas now, of course, I have a much broader knowledge of writing styles, apocalyptic books like this, all sorts of things. So it's funny the way you can approach a book so differently over such a long period of time. And I think I had a sense of this book, a sense of its power, but I didn't fully understand it or get to grips with it at the time. This time round, I really, really liked it. I also think, I probably mentioned this too much, but having become a parent, I feel like the relationship between the man and boy definitely felt closer to home this time. So I think that was also an element with this. I mean, yeah, it'd be interesting to know what I would have thought of it like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So it follows, if you don't know, it follows a man and a boy unnamed in the aftermath of some apocalyptic event, which is never fully explained, which is vague as I remembered. You know, at the time I think I had less experience, like I say, with vague narratives, whereas now I'm very accustomed to them and even like them. So, you know, the man and boy are walking somewhere through America. I think there are clues as to where it is throughout, and it's just grey ash as far as the eye can see. Like, everything is grey. If you want to parody this book, it's all about the greyness. There's grey dust everywhere. So the man must find them food and protect them. Obviously nothing's growing anymore, so he has to find them canned food basically, wherever he can, and most of it's been taken already. So there's a lot of starvation going on, and he also has to protect them from thieves, and even worse, from, you know, bands of cannibals. He's obviously got a boy with him. There's very few children left, so that adds an extra layer of terror basically for the father, because there's, you know, bands of people going about doing terrible things. They're making their way south towards the sea, so yeah, I think they walk through some of the southern states towards the coast and Florida and that kind of thing. And yeah, I just found the relationship between the man and the boy to be really, really beautifully written. It's in small moments. We get some of the father's internal thoughts and feelings, so you've got those parts as well, but also just in the small moments of tenderness between them. I liked how quite gentle the father was. I mean, obviously not the whole time, because parents lose their shit, especially parents in an apocalypse, but his father was quite gentle with him. Yeah, it just felt very touching to me. Yes, there is terrifying action here. Sometimes it slips into full-blown horror. It was a good October read, but there's also a lot of slow, monotonous moments. There's repetitive moments, obviously, because this would be repetitive. You know, they've always got to search for food. They're always on the road. At the same time as those two things, it also reads kind of like a parable somewhere. Faith seems to be a really big theme in this, so that's unsurprising. Dialogue is unpunctuated, and sort of some of it's kind of just very terse and brief, so you kind of have to follow closely who's speaking. It's the kind of thing I don't mind, but it does irritate some readers. But yeah, it won't be for everyone. It is very grey, a little bit monotonous and repetitive, like I say, but such beauty in there. Some of the turns of phrase are just incredible. It's reminded me to read more Cormac McCarthy, and yeah, the parent-child relationship, like I said, really got me this time. It won't be for everyone, this one, but it's a quiet, kind of unassuming take, but also filled with quite a lot of power, I think, a lot of violence and also a lot of love. So it's unassuming, but it's kind of powerful. But this, yeah, quite unassuming take on the apocalypse genre just really appealed to me, and I would definitely recommend. So don't have this one yet, but The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. This year's Booker Prize winner. I read this one on my Kindle, that's why I don't have it yet, but I would like to buy it because I enjoyed it a lot. Considering I couldn't even finish last year's winner, The Promise, I wasn't expecting much simply because it won the Booker Prize or because it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, because that doesn't mean much to me anymore. But I was very, very pleasantly surprised by this in the end, and I think it's a worthy winner. I haven't read a lot of the shortlisters or longlisters, but of the ones I have, I definitely can see why this one was picked as the winner. Also, but speaking of last year's longlist, Anuk Arud Pragasam's novel, A Passage North, that was my favourite. But did I read any more? I think I started The Promise, didn't like it at all, and then I read A Passage North. But A Passage North was a gorgeous book and should have won the Booker. I don't care. Whatever other books were on the list, I don't care. It's such a beautiful book, kind of Proustian take on the Sri Lankan Civil War. So both books are about the Sri Lankan Civil War from the perspective of young men. A Passage North is more of a retrospective, whereas Seven Moons is set during the Civil War. Both extremely different, like I say. A Passage North is kind of more Proustian, quiet, reflective, slow-paced. Seven Moons is definitely more, it's kind of psychedelic almost, got kind of fantastical elements to it, not a piece of realism. So they're completely different, but I really liked both of them. But anyway, Seven Moons, it's set in Colombo in 1989. We follow Maali Almeida. He's a photographer who will sell his pictures to anyone on all sides of the war. He'll sell them to the Tigers, he'll sell them to the army, the government, he'll sell them to the foreign press. He claims to be impartial, right? He is also firmly in the closet. He is taking part in a relationship, clandestine relationship with a minister's son, so someone in the government's son, but he's not faithful to that relationship, much to Dee, his partner's dismay. And we meet him in the aftermath of his death. He's in some sort of vast, chaotic waiting room, and he has a list of things he needs to do, and he's got 7 moons before he can go, or needs to go into the light. Otherwise, he'll be stuck in this kind of liminal, in-between type space. So basically, it is the afterlife layered over Colombo in the 1980s, so he can follow people in the aftermath of his death. He can maybe influence what's going to happen, but yeah, the people in charge, the authorities, don't want him to linger there. It's not good for the soul, and there are dangers involved with lingering there past 7 moons, so they want him to go into the light, but he wants to attend to what's happening in the aftermath of his death. So the first 100 pages of the book just failed to capture me. I think this was partly a problem with my focus, because when I was reading it, because I wasn't fully focused when I was reading it, it is quite kind of chaotic, and Karunatilaka sort of assumes that you know Maali and his life, because it's mostly addressed, I can't remember if it goes all the way through, but it's addressed in second person, so the author is addressing you, and you are Maali. So obviously you're supposed to have knowledge of your life, and you as the reader sort of have to catch up. Plus, so there's that element, plus we're in this kind of psychedelic afterlife, which is filled with strange characters. So you've got two things that you need to find your footing with, and like I said, my focus wasn't fully there. But after that 100-page mark, it definitely, first of all, my focus got more intense, because I had finished my other books and I was focused on this one book, so that helps. But also the story picks up and becomes more linear. So the first 100 pages, he's confused, he doesn't really know what's happening or how he died, it's kind of refusing to admit that he's died to himself, but then we get to the point where he has a specific goal in mind. So it definitely does get more linear, and the storyline picks up from then on. I wasn't sure if I would end up caring for Maali and his friends, especially in that opening section where I just didn't really understand what was happening. But I really did. I don't know how, I don't know what it was in the narrative that kind of made me care, but I definitely did start caring for Maali and his friends, and I really wanted him to succeed so basically what he wants to do is get his friends to uncover his most controversial pictures and show them to the city and show them to the world to uncover the full extent of all the atrocities of the Civil War. So it definitely reminded me of Marlon James's work, with the kind of, it is quite violent and gory at times, it's experimental, a lot for the senses almost. Obviously Marlon James also has a lot of queer characters in his novels, as main characters as well. So yeah, if you like Marlon James's work, I think you'll probably like this book too. But yeah, I really enjoyed it and I think it was masterful. I think the plot line was kind of intricate and it would have been really difficult to write this book, I think. So, but not only is it kind of accomplished, but it also was enjoyable, especially after that 100-page mark, so I would definitely recommend this one. And then finally, we've got Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. Not finally in my kind of top category for this month, this past couple of months. Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It's a lovely little novella set in the 80s in a small Irish town. And this man called Bill Furlong, he is a dedicated husband, a hard worker, he is a father of 5 girls. He makes this discovery about the church and the local convent and the girls that are living there when he's making a delivery one morning. And, you know, it's a quiet story that kind of champions beautiful little moments, really beautifully, elegantly written, but it's also obviously examining kind of societal complicity, the power of the church, very specifically I can't remember exactly what they're called, but the systems that were run in Ireland for young women who found themselves pregnant, often treated very cruelly. But yeah, it's about, you know, those moments where we can choose the easy road in life or we can choose the right thing to do. There's a lot packed into a very small space here. You could read it in an afternoon with ease. It's also set around Christmas, so it is a nice read for this time of year, even though it is dealing with some heavy stuff. But like I say, it is quite beautifully written and I would definitely recommend this. I definitely want to read more Claire Keegan as well. So before we go into my sort of next level, which is good instead of great, I did want to talk about House of Leaves because I know lots of you are interested in my review of this one. This one comes in my final category for today, which is the fine. Good but heavily flawed, but I did want to speak about it further up this video because I know lots of you are interested in my final review of it. And I did obviously that little mini reading vlog for it too at the end of October, so if you've watched that you've probably heard me speak about most of this stuff, to be fair. But to sum it up, I was a little disappointed by this book, it's got to be said. I feel like I'm harder on books like this because they do purport to be, you know, clever and challenging, which is all the things that I like. Obviously it's speculative fiction, so it's all the things that I like, and so I feel like I'm harder on them when I have problems with them. What's it about if you don't know about it? It's kind of a bit of a cult novel. It's considered a horror. I would label it a horror even though people say it's genre bending. I don't know that it is genre bending. I would consider this a horror novel. It's just clever. I mean, you can have clever horror novels. So it's one of those kind of nested, layered narratives, which is like a story within a story within a story. It's about Johnny Truant. He's a club kid from LA, and his friend Lude lives in an apartment building with an old man named Zampano, who is sort of mysterious. He only comes out once a day to walk around the courtyard with a bunch of cats. He's also blind, and when he dies, strangely, I'm not sure it's ever really explained, as much as this novel is not, Lude invites Johnny to his apartment to have a look around, and there they find this kind of these masses of writings about a subject, kind of beginning of an academic treatise, quite a amateurish academic work, which is kind of referenced throughout the book. I'm not just being rude and saying that. Johnny considers it quite amateurish, about a documentary called The Navidson Record. So for some reason, again not fully explained, Johnny takes it upon himself to put together these writings, read them, put them together into some sort of readable thing, which is the House of Leaves. Yes, so what we have is these academic writings about the Navidson Record. So the Navidson Record is a documentary that doesn't exist in Johnny's world, at least. So it's filled with footnotes, references to academics talking about the Navidson Record, celebrities talking about the Navidson Record, you know, so much stuff that the fact that it doesn't exist is very odd to begin with. We have the core of the story is this treatise on the Navidson record, and then we have Zampano's footnotes, and then we have Johnny's footnotes, which he adds in random stuff and possibly tinkers with the text a fair bit too, and then we have another layer which is the editor's footnotes. Editors have put together this edition of the House of Leaves, including Johnny's stuff and Zampano's stuff and stuff of their own. So the core story is very interesting. The core story is about a house which is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. It uses the old classic haunted house tropes, but in an unusual and interesting way. A family with 2 kids moves into the house. The husband is a photojournalist and documentary maker, and so he makes a documentary about the house. It's supposed to be a nice documentary about them moving to the countryside and sort of enjoying a slower pace of life, but it ends up obviously being a horror story. The sort of thing we're all familiar with. I've thought a lot of the way Danielewski handles all of that is very interesting and well done. So this is a good story wrapped in way too much extraneous material. Much of it terrible. Johnny's sections in particular are pretty awful throughout. At the beginning I thought there must be a point to this. Reader, there was never a point to this. I have no real idea why Johnny's sections are there, and I'm sure some fans of House of Leaves can come in and tell me like the 2 narratives are supposed to mirror one another and there's connections between the 2 of them. Absolutely there is. But what does it add? What does it really add? I don't know. It's most of his editions document his drink and drug fueled sexual encounters with, to my mind, pretty vulnerable women. You know, very graphic sex scenes. There's a lot of mummy issues with Johnny. In general, even in Zampano's sections, the footnotes are just overdone for me. The tricks are overdone. I liked the elements of academic satire, you know, adding in stupid footnotes for this, that and the other, and just, before we can start on this, we must have a definition of this. Sort of, that all the academic satirical stuff did appeal to me because, you know, I do love it when people take the piss out of academics, but it was just overdone to the point of like hiding all the interesting material in the book, let alone when you add in all of Johnny's tinkerings. The female characters so badly handled. Sometimes I felt like maybe Danielewski knew what he was doing there and he was trying to give them more power than it seemed, and like he was aware of how misogynist the text is, but at the same time like it's just the text was misogynist. Yeah, so yes, I think some of those issues come from the text being quite postmodern. It's obviously influenced by the likes of Derrida. I know Danielewski worked on a documentary on Derrida. It's obviously influenced by deconstructionism. It's obviously influenced by post-structuralism. In the kind of slippage of meaning, you can't get the truth out of anything. You know, all the uncertainties throughout the book. But the thing is, I sort of find that on its own, and certain branches of that, including the one that this book seems to be influenced by, just not very convincing, ultimately not very interesting, because you just make everything devoid of meaning. It's just not my cup of tea in terms of theory, and there's so much theory in here that it's hard to ignore it. It's also got a hefty dose of Freudianism and psychoanalysis, which, again, I just don't like those 2 bodies of theory particularly. I don't find them very interesting or convincing or any of those things. I appreciate them as to where they stand in the history of theory and what they've contributed to newer theories or more interesting theories, or like the kind of riffs people do off them, which are much more interesting, but them on their own are not for me, and I felt like this book had too much of those 2 bodies of theory. I just don't like them. Yeah, the complete uncertainty that the whole novel conjures up means that you could make almost any reading of it. You know, you could close read this book like crazy. You would come up with probably any reading of it that you liked, which I think takes away from the fun. Like, you don't want something to just be completely, it kind of makes the heart of the book a void. Like, it's devoid of real heart or meaning or substance. It's all style, no substance, this book. It's kind of intentionally doing that because the house is this big, scary void. It's like a weird, dark labyrinth with nothing in it. And so it's kind of the point, but I suppose at the end of the day, it's just taste-wise, this book wasn't for me. And there will be people out there who just completely vibe with all those things and really like all those things, and that totally works for them. But it just did not work for me, I have to say. Yeah, it was just too much and very tedious as a result. But there were so many good creepy moments and so many good moments in the core of the story that it annoyed me even more, because I was like, why can't we just get more of this? And there were some really good ideas in there about the house and the concept of a house that's bigger on the inside than the outside. I think there were some really interesting things happening, so diluted by too much show ponying, in my opinion. Further ranting, but people sometimes call this a love story, which I think is laughable. Because of the ending to the... I assume because of the ending. There is no... You don't feel that love, okay? There's no moment where you're like, oh, yes. I mean, in terms of its form, you could see it as a love story. There's no real feeling to it. And I think it wasn't helped by the fact that I had just read Stoner and The Road. Both extremely different from each other. Both with not a word wasted between them, right? Everything there is so intentional. And you come out of these two books feeling something. I didn't. Oh, almost knocked over my coffee. I did anyway. Like, these are masters of novel writing, in my opinion. Like, as I say, both completely different. This one's so specific. This one kind of vague. But beautifully, beautifully written. This one just paled in comparison to those two. And so these two really have that heart. And they have something to say about life. So, yes, I was disappointed by this book, I'm afraid. And sorry I got so ranty about it. But like I say, I hold that sort of book to a higher standard because it just has so much potential to be good and just doesn't quite get there, and it annoys me. I don't know if I'm going to get a load of haters on this video hating me for not liking House of Leaves. I fear that I might be, because I feel like it's one of those novels like that people just really, really love. It's probably just a taste thing, right? Let's talk Beyond the Burn Line. So back to books I quite liked by Paul McAuley. Some of these books you'll notice were my review books for the Sunday Times. So this is one of those. This is a novel with a really unusual, ambitious premise. And sometimes that alone can kind of elevate it amongst its peers. You know, when I'm looking at a stack of speculative fiction to potentially read and write about for the Sunday Times, I see a lot of similar stuff. But this one was so unusual. It really, really stood out. So it's about an intelligent animal species that has kind of inherited the earth, I suppose, as the most intelligent species. So they were the former slaves of a race of intelligent bears who fell victim to a mind-wrecking plague a few hundred years prior to the start of this book. Humans lived, I think, 200,000 years prior to the start of this book. And the burn line, beyond the burn line, so the burn line references we basically ended up killing ourselves through catastrophic climate change. So the burn line refers to the archaeological record of kind of humans and post-humans. So this is a novel of two halves. In the first half, it kind of reminded me at times of the 5th season, because this is about a society so far in the future that it's almost gone back to basics. It's very much it's a pre-industrial society. You know, these people are living in small communities. You know, it's low tech. And the first half of the novel follows a person called Pilgrim Saltmeyer. His master has just died. He was like kind of a secretary to an academic, and his master was, to the detriment of his own reputation, investigating sightings of strange others. So he wants to continue his master's work, even though his master's family do not want him to, and so he goes about trying to find the funding basically to do that. The second half puts us even further into the future, but I don't want to spoil the plot. To say too much about this book I think would spoil it. Yeah, I really liked the writing style of the opening sections. The world building is gorgeous. It feels kind of warm and inviting and old-fashioned as well. I was less enamoured with the second part of the novel, and I also thought it was overlong. The first part as well, whilst it started off really great, it didn't quite push to where I wanted it to go. But overall, it's quite an enchanting, I think I called it an enchanting sci-fi, I can't remember, which is a rare combination. And it's interesting, it's doing something new. I do wish there had been more. I thought when we were talking, when, you know, we had that opening pages and these animals were being described as a people, we were kind of going to get more examination of what it kind of means to be a person rather than a human, and kind of non-human intelligence and that kind of thing. And in general, there are a few things that I would have liked a bit more ambition on, but the writing style's nice. Like I say, it's quite enchanting, especially that first half, and it's a really interesting concept. I also wish the kind of storyline had gone somewhere slightly different. I think it was a little predictable at certain points, but overall a very interesting take on a sci-fi, and I would recommend it if that sounds like your cup of tea. Final book shortlisted to talk about is The Trees by Percival Everett. You may remember I recently talked about A Telephone, which I read of his, and so I was very excited about The Trees. It's quite different. I think that I haven't read more than Telephone and The Trees, but from what I've read of Everett's work, I think that's fairly typical of him. I think he writes quite differently across each book. In general, The Trees didn't work as well as a novel for me than Telephone. It's still a kind of worthy book. I can see why it was on the shortlist. Yes, which you can't say of every book for sure. So there's definitely things to like about this book. It's a satire. It pokes fun at the detective novel, just the genre of the detective novel, but as well as looking at race relations in the US, so particularly lynching. And it makes equivalent lynching with war and like all-out war on people of colour, which I think makes absolute sense. You know, it looks at the kind of enduring difficulty of race relations in the US when they haven't fully addressed the consequences of lynching and, you know, decades and decades of high volumes of lynching. So yes, being a satire definitely prevents you sometimes from getting a strong emotional connection to the characters. You know, the characters are types. So, but anyway, it opens with 2 murders in the town of Money, Mississippi. One of the dead bodies just kind of disappears. It sort of seems like it's walked off of its own accord soon after it's taken to the morgue. So yeah, like I say, there's less to emotionally connect with in this book, even though it's obviously about a serious and devastating topic. And there are a couple moments which will really kind of hit you, for sure. They do exist in there, they're just not everywhere. It is sort of repetitive, sort of by design. I don't want to ruin the kind of arc of the book too much, but it is a little bit repetitive. Yeah, so those things sort of added up to a less enjoyable or engaging book than, say, Telephone. But as I say, it was very clever. I enjoyed a lot of the satire as well. It's, you know, it's very biting, it's very dark. I think Everett had some really interesting things to say about the legacy of lynching, and I will continue reading Everett's work. Next we have Expect Me Tomorrow by Christopher Priest. So from the author of The Prestige, we get yet another sci-fi set across a few hundred years with interconnected characters thing. This seems to be such a popular plot at the moment. The father of the genre obviously being Cloud Atlas, which I could never quite finish. I don't know if it's time to return to it. I only tried soon after it came out. It came out in 2004, so that's a very long time ago. But I could never really get into it. But just this year, I can think of How High We Go in the Dark. I can think of Sea of Tranquility. It's such a popular kind of plot line at the minute, or genre, I suppose. It's like a kind of sub-genre of sci-fi. Now, to me, my experience with this genre is not very good. It seems impressive, but I often find its execution to be uneven. It's so hard. Oh, I can think of another one. Hanya Yanagihara's newest novel, To Paradise, is another one. Yeah, its execution is often really uneven. Like, each story needs to work completely by itself, but also be tied to the other stories for good reason, not just tenuously, for good reason. And then the writing style, I feel, should change, but it doesn't often change. Yeah, sustaining that kind of narrative across a few hundred years, I just haven't found one that's worked for me yet. And then not only are you doing a narrative over a few hundred years, you're adding in a speculative element. So there's so much to think about. I think Priest manages it pretty well here. This is kind of a piece of climate fiction, as many of these novels are. I suppose it kind of works in terms of a climate perspective because climate change happens over such a long period of time in the grand scheme of things. In one timeline we follow a glaciologist from the 19th century who's discovering the beginnings of climate change. You know, kind of industrial stuff is happening. In the other we follow Chad. First of all, I'm really sorry to anyone who's named Chad, but something about this name, it just makes me think of Chad Michael Murray, and that's all I can think about. I just don't find it a believable name for anyone else on the planet. In the other timeline we follow Chad, a man living in our near future. He's living on the crumbling south coast of England, and Chad has access to a new technology via his job with the police, from which he's recently been let go, and with it he manages to make contact with his antecedents, who happen to be this glaciologist. So this is a really engaging novel. I enjoyed the sciencey bits from the glaciologist for sure. I think, you know, it sustains your interest pretty much throughout. The pacing's pretty good. And it ends up at the kind of more optimistic end of climate fiction, which sometimes you just gotta read something slightly optimistic on that front. There were some bits of it that struck me as a little bit odd. There's an inclusion of a real life story of a man named John Smythe, obviously not his real name, who tricked women into giving them his money, giving him their money and their belongings in the 1870s. And apparently I think it changed the law or something. And it's included, it seems like it's super important at the beginning, and it's included throughout, and it's included again at the end, and it's sort of, everything's wrapped up. But I was just left asking, like, why is it here? Because the main focus of the story does seem to be this, like, climate narrative. I just had no idea why it was there. No idea. Like, it was tied in, it was included, it was fully concluded, but why was it there? I've got no idea. Sorry, it's clear to me that I'm feeling ranty today, but let me just remind you that I actually enjoyed reading most of these books that I read this month, and I think all of them sort of added to my reading experience in some way, even if I didn't love them. It's a solid read, and if it does sound like it would appeal to you, then I would try it. Or if you are writing an article about the millions of books being released with this sort of plot line, someone should write that. Not me, because I don't want to read them, but... Okay, next up we have Eden by Jim Crace. This is set in the Garden of Eden, many, many years after the casting out of Adam and Eve. A small community lives there now in paradise, alongside a group of feathered angels who appear like great big blue birds. God himself is notably absent throughout, which brings a few of Crace's kind of questions into play. I enjoyed reading this kind of take on this story. It obviously kind of reads in a biblical way. You know, the kind of one of the major points being with no death or real suffering or sort of linear time. Some of the inhabitants of this Eden, including angels, feel frustrated with their lives. You know, there's nothing really to grip onto, and you know, they begin to become curious about what's outside the walls of their home. So this Eden is a real situated place on Earth, and outside the walls is, you know, normal life, normal mortal life happening. And, you know, we spend a lot of time with the people in the garden, tending to the garden. There were things to like about this. Like I say, it's quite an interesting thing to write about. But I ended up being a little bit underwhelmed by it. I think that biblical style gets in the way of you, again, having a connection with the characters. And though they did have distinct personalities from one another, you don't feel it, you know, you don't feel that coming through. You know, so yeah, the narrative about how boring this life is becomes a bit boring. And the other part of it, the kind of plot line, is basically just a retelling of the Edenic story. I'm not sure what new interpretation it brings to us. I'm not sure what it adds. It probably doesn't help that the devil in this is a much more kind of nuanced character. The kind of tempter or whatever is a much more nuanced character. So I think it doesn't have the drama. You know, it doesn't have the drama of the original story, but it has some of the monotony and lack of kind of connection to it. So yeah, I was left wanting more. There are also just elements I felt like if you're going to retell the story, you've got to have a bit more to say than, you know, life without time is not really a life, you know, it's got to have another level to it, I think. So yeah, I was a bit disappointed by it, but it was a kind of interesting, it was well written and, you know, it was unusual. Family Business by Jonathan Sims. This is a straight up horror novel. I think Jonathan Sims has a kind of little small cult horror following. There were things to like about this, other things I didn't like so much. Didn't find it super creepy, didn't find it super scary. There were a couple of moments, but not loads. I think one of the problems I have with horror novels is that a lot of it, I don't want to spoil this one too much, but a lot of them are resolved by saying, oh, it's just some supernatural creature. I'm always a kind of bit like it sets it up like a mystery or something you have to find out, and it's like, oh, it's a supernatural creature. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's why I think I prefer, from my current experiences with horror, and I do like lots of novels that are kind of tinged with horror, but have other speculative elements to them, because that story arc doesn't work for me so much. Like, if you set it up as a mystery and it turns out to be a supernatural creature, I'm not going to love it. I want more structure. I want more reveal. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I don't mean to ruin it, but this one does have that to it. It's about a girl called Dia. She's recently lost her best friend, like her favourite person in the world, her flatmate, and she sort of accidentally ends up in this job, a family business, cleaning up after the dead. So, you know, if someone dies in their flat, they've got to clean up the flat. Usually the body's not there, but they do all the rest. And she starts having these sort of strange visions when she's on site, I suppose. It was one of those novels which I started reading sort of a little bit of, just to see if I would like it, and I ended up continuing. So it definitely draws you in. Like, the writing style is very readable. It's kind of nicely fleshed out and paced, but I did find on this one had that kind of third of a mark, that it was getting a bit repetitive, that it wasn't really going too many places. One thing I did really appreciate about it is the kind of it had a political sort of element to it, you know, about the most vulnerable in our society, about people that are forgotten by society, and a kind of anti-establishment edge to it. So I did appreciate that about this one. And I did like the writing, just, yeah, the story didn't quite work for me. And finally, this is another reread, so I'll just briefly talk about it. I wanted to mention it because I did have a slightly different perspective on it this time round. This is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Iain Reid. Obviously I've read this once, so I know what the big twist is, and so I was kind of aware what it was throughout as I was reading. I found it to be a weaker novel than I did the first time round. I quite liked it the first time round. Of course, the whole book, you can read it, it's filled with clues as to the conclusion, you know. Basically every sentence you can be like, I know what's happening there. But in general, I just found the story and the execution just a little bit too muddy. Like, it just wouldn't, I can't exactly describe it, but it was like there was plot holes, or it just didn't quite come together properly for me, because yeah, knowing the storyline, I was close to reading it so much more that I felt like it just missed the mark a little bit. I don't know exactly how. I'd have to read it again to tell you exactly how, which I'm not going to do, but I will say that Reid does a great job of being creepy and atmospheric, and that in itself is hard to do. I am interested to read more of Reid's work. I think I will come back to him next year, because he's got a couple more books for spooky season. But yeah, I would like to come back to Reid, because I think he's got a mastery of the creepiness, and so I would like to try his other books, see if he's kind of matured as a writer since writing that one. Right, my loves, thank you so much for watching today. Hope you get on well with these two. If you want to read them with us, I'll see you soon. Bye.